Hello, scholars. This is Mr. Myers, lesson 2.9 on checks and balances. As always, take good structured notes. Here are our objectives, and let's go ahead and begin. So, we're broken this down into four different parts. The first is just simply what is a check and a balance and the separation of powers, and then specifically the checks and balances for each of the three branches of government. So, the first thing that you need to know is that there is a difference between separation of powers and checks and balances, and oftentimes students interchange those terms. The separation of powers refers to the fact that there are specific powers that are given to different branches of government, so that there are powers that the executive has that are different than the powers of the legislative, and so on and so forth. Each of these is going to have special duties, and this was developed by a man named Baron de Montesquieu in a book called The Spirit of Laws in 1748. It was an extremely influential French philosopher. So once the powers are separated, then each of the branches has certain powers over the other branches of government. So we separate the branches, and then we make sure that each can check the power of the other to keep them from becoming too strong. And this also is credited to Montesquieu. So make sure you know the difference between separation of powers and checks and balances. So my recommendation for these last three slides is to pause, to take some notes. You can do it in table format or however you want to do it. Copy down these particular checks, and then you can go back and listen and then add some detail or some anecdotes as you go. So you might want to skip some lines and save some space. So in terms of the legislative, they check the executive by overriding presidential vetoes, by impeaching the president. They can refuse to confirm nominees or treaties that are negotiated by the president. The most relevant anecdote here would be the death of Antonin Scalia and the fact that Obama will get to appoint a new justice, but that it has to be approved by the Senate. So that's a check that the Senate has over the executive. The legislative can also appropriate funds or refuse to appropriate funds. So the president can go to war because he's commander-in-chief, but the Congress doesn't have to fund or pay for it. In terms of the judiciary, the Congress creates lower courts. They can change the number of Supreme Court justices. That was attempted by FDR during the New Deal when he tried to increase the number of judges from 9 to 15, which was a huge disaster. It was called the court packing scheme. Even members of his own party said this is a really bad idea. The legislative can also impeach and remove judges, just like the president. They can refuse to confirm judges, and they can also propose constitutional amendments to override certain Supreme Court decisions. Okay, now for the executive checks on the legislative and the judicial branch. In terms of the executive checks on the legislative, they can veto acts of Congress. This is by far the most often used and important executive check on the legislature. They can recommend legislation, so think FDR and the New Deal or Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. Oftentimes presidents will come in with very specific ideas of what they want accomplished, and they'll give that to senators or representatives to introduce or sponsor on the floor of the House. They can use the office of the president as a bully pulpit. When you're president of the United States, you get lots of media attention, you get to make lots of speeches, and basically you can use your office as a vehicle to try to influence not only the American people, but Congress and foreign officials as well. So the bully pulpit refers to using the power of the presidency in order to try to influence people through rhetoric and speeches and other actions. And this last one is a little bit of a gray area here. Technically, the president can choose not to enforce certain federal laws if they believe they're unconstitutional, because part of the job of the president is to protect and defend the Constitution. This is a little bit of a gray area. In terms of the judiciary, they can nominate and appoint federal judges, they can grant pardons to federal officials, and the same thing, they can refuse to enforce federal court decisions, again, if they think they're unconstitutional. Again, a gray area. The last one is definitely the easiest. The judicial checks on the legislative would be to rule laws unconstitutional. By far they're most important and established in the case known as Marbury v. Madison. And their main check on the executive would be to rule executive actions unconstitutional. One of the cases working its way through the Supreme Court right now is whether or not President Obama's executive actions on climate change are constitutional or not. So that's an example. Here is your objective again, and I hope that you took good notes and be ready for a quiz tomorrow. Have a great night.